John Krakauer here. 21 minutes and 13 seconds into the video Michael Tracy posted on September 4th, 2004, titled South Summit on the Ascent, he announces that he wants to, quote, address the way Krakauer changes times to fit his narrative. For Krakauer's narrative of events above South Summit, there are two key pieces of information he fabricates. The first is the time of day that Rob Hall turned Doug Hansen around the previous year, 1995. In his book, Krakauer states it was 2:30 p.m. That is not close to accurate, as the Himalayan Database records all the times that day for different events and reports that a decision to turn around was taken at 1 p.m. Indeed, Rob Hall had set 1 p.m. as the turnaround time for John Krakauer's team in 1996, but Krakauer needs to push the time to 2 p.m. because he didn't make it to the summit by the 1 p.m. original turnaround time. So Krakauer also invented the 2:30 turnaround time in 1995 to make it seem like Rob Hall used a different turnaround time in 1995. Krakauer was not there in 1995, so this is not his faulty memory. He had access to the expedition reports maintained in Elizabeth Hawley's Himalayan Database, and these would be the most accurate descriptions of what took place that day. End quote. Almost everything Tracy alleges in the excerpt above is false. As I mentioned in the first chapter of this treatise, expedition reports in the Himalayan Database filed during the 1990s often contain numerous errors. Contrary to Tracy's assertion, by no means does the Himalayan Database provide the most accurate data about what happened on Rob Hall's expeditions to Everest in 1995 and 1996. Instead of relying on the Himalayan Database as my primary source, as Tracy does, after I returned home from Nepal, I interviewed more than 30 individuals who were present on Everest in 1995 and 1996 and actually witnessed what occurred. Tracy has never been on the Nepal side of Everest, nor to my knowledge has he ever interviewed anyone who is a member of Rob Hall's or Scott Fisher's Everest expeditions. Instead of relying on sources with first-hand knowledge of the relevant events, as I did, in this video Tracy seems to have relied on little more than speculation based on incorrect or misinterpreted data to make false allegations intended to discredit me. Tracy's claim that I, quote, invented the 2:30 turnaround time in 1995 was apparently in reaction to what I wrote in this long passage from Chapter 17 of Into Thin Air. Quote, Scott Fisher ascended to the summit around 3:40 on the afternoon of May 10, 1996, to find his devoted friend and Sirdar, Lobsang Jangbu, waiting for him. The Sherpa pulled his radio from inside his down jacket, made contact with Ingrid Hunt at base camp, and then handed the walkie-talkie to Fisher. "We all made it," Fisher told Hunt, 11,400 feet below. "God, I'm tired." Around this time, two Sherpas on the Taiwanese team arrived, followed soon thereafter by Makalu Gao. Rob Hall was there too, waiting impatiently for Doug Hansen to appear as a rising tide of cloud lapped ominously at the summit ridge. According to Lobsang, during the 15 or 20 minutes Fisher spent on the summit, he complained repeatedly that he wasn't feeling well, something the stoic guide almost never did. "Scott, tell to me, I am too tired. I am sick also, need medicine for stomach," Lobsang recalls. "I gave him tea, but he drank just a little bit, just half a cup. So I tell to him, 'Scott, please, we go fast down.' So we come down then." Fisher started down first, about 3:55. Lobsang reports that although Scott had used supplemental oxygen during the entire ascent, and his third canister was more than 3/4 full when he left the summit, for some reason he took his mask off and stopped using it. Shortly after Fisher left the top, Gao and his Sherpas departed as well, and finally Lobsang headed down, leaving Hall alone on the summit awaiting Hansen. A moment after Lobsang started down, about 4 o'clock, Hansen at last appeared, toughing it out, moving painfully slowly over the last bump on the ridge. As soon as he saw Hansen, Hall hurried down to meet him. Hall's obligatory turnaround time had come and gone a full 2 hours earlier. Given the guide's conservative, exceedingly methodical nature, many of his colleagues have expressed puzzlement at this uncharacteristic lapse of judgment. Why, they wondered, didn't he turn Hansen around much lower on the mountain, as soon as it became obvious that the American climber was running late? Exactly 1 year earlier, 1995, Hall had turned Hansen around on the south summit at 2:30 p.m., and to be denied so close to the top was a crushing disappointment to Hansen. He told me several times that he'd returned to Everest in 1996, largely as a result of Hall's advocacy. He said Rob had called him from New Zealand a dozen times, urging him to give it another shot. And this time Doug was absolutely determined to bag the top. Quote, "I want to get this thing done and out of my life," he told me 3 days earlier at Camp 2. "I don't want to have to come back here. I'm getting too old for this shit." End quote. When I wrote that Rob Hall turned Hansen around at 2:30 p.m. in 1995, I based that statement on tape-recorded interviews I did with 3 individuals who were working for Hall on Everest at the time: Ed Viesters and Guy Cotter, who were employed by Hall as guides on the 1995 expedition, and Lopsang Zhongbu, who was working for Hall that year and was the lead climbing Sherpa for their summit bid. In an interview I did with Viesters in June 1996, he told me this about the 1995 expedition. Quote, "We got to the south summit at 1:30. The snow was deep. We'd been climbing since 11 or 12 a.m. It was cold and windy. We knew it was going to take at least 2 hours from the south summit to the summit. I remember Rob and I looked at each other when we first got there, and we both shook our heads. We knew we were going to turn around right then and there. First, however, we tried forcing a trail across the ridge above the south summit, but realized no, it's too late, and we won't have enough time to get down. Also, Guy started kicking steps with Lopsang across the traverse, and they kicked off a slab avalanche down the Kangshung face. The combination of the deep snow, the wind, and the lateness of the day, there was no question about what we should do. Plus, the route wasn't fixed. Around 2:30, Rob told everybody, 'Hey, we're turning around, sorry.' So we all turned around, but Lopsang kept going on his own, and relatively quickly went to the summit. He should have turned around. We needed him. When we turned around, Chantal collapsed at the south summit. A note here, client Chantal Mauduit was a famous French alpinist who was trying to climb Everest without bottled oxygen at the time. We spent the rest of the day dragging her off the mountain. Meanwhile, Lopsang was fooling around on the summit. I chewed him out a little. This interview with Viesters, which was corroborated by my interviews with Cotter and Lopsang, makes it clear why I believe Hall turned his team around at 2:30 rather than 1 p.m., as the Himalayan Database incorrectly reported. Regarding Lopsang's unauthorized trip to the summit when everyone else headed down, it created a serious problem for Hall, Viesters, and Cotter because Chantal Mauduit wasn't the only client on Hall's team to collapse that day in 1995. As Viesters told me, Doug Hansen collapsed on the south summit too. Quote, "He was fine during the ascent, but as soon as he started down, he lost it, mentally and physically. He turned into a zombie, like he'd used everything up. He was very tired, not even grabbing the fixed rope as he was staggering down. I remember yelling at him. I'd lost my voice, so I'd have to get right in his face and scream at him. And he could still barely hear me. 'Doug, you gotta wake up. You gotta grab the rope. Use the rope.' Later, just below the southeast ridge, he started running out of oxygen, so I gave him my bottle. After that, he was able to get down with Guy's help." Viesters thinks a similar thing happened to Hansen in 1996. Quote, "I think he just pushed himself to the max to get to the top, and when he got there, he was totally out of gas." Viesters believes that Hall's desire to put clients on the summit was a significant factor in his failure to turn Hansen around in 1996 when he obviously should have. Quote, "The competition between Hall and Scott Fisher to get as many clients as possible to the top was real," Viesters told me. "And Rob's major market was the United States. If you're successful this year, you're going to get clients next year." End quote. Earlier in this piece, I mentioned Tracy's reliance on incorrect data from the Himalayan Database to support his false claims. Another false allegation by Tracy based on bad data in the Himalayan Database occurs 23 minutes into this same video, when he refers to the second of the, quote, 2 key pieces of information he claims I fabricated earlier in the video, at the 21:13 mark. Quote, "The second piece that Krakauer fabricated is the time the Taiwanese summited. The Himalayan Database and the Taiwan team, in an interview with Jane Bromett, both listed their summit time at around 3 p.m., and the Himalayan Database specifically states Gao got there prior to Scott Fisher. As Jane Bromett spoke Mandarin Chinese, it's unlikely something was lost in translation. It is not clear where Krakauer got his 3:45 summit time. Some other climbing times reported by Krakauer, such as those of Goran Kropp, match with the Himalayan Database report. But for an unexplained reason, Krakauer simply pushed Makalau Gao's summit time back 45 minutes without explaining that Gao's own account differed significantly. As Krakauer was nowhere near the summit at 3:45 and could not see the summit at 3:45, this is not a case of Krakauer's faulty memory. He had to get the time from somewhere else, and few people on the summit at 3:45 survived, much less would have had accurate memories of exactly what time everything happened. I wrote that Makalu Gao and the two Sherpas on his team, Mingma Sering and Nima Gambu, reached the summit at approximately 3:45 p.m. To substantiate this assertion, I relied on a radio call Fisher made to base camp when he reached the summit, a long, detailed interview I conducted with Lobsang in July 1996, and crucially, the photo that appears on page 293 of Into Thin Air, the illustrated edition. This photo, which was taken by Scott Fisher, shows Lobsang and one of Makalu Gao's two Sherpas posing on the summit. I don't know whether it's Mingma Tsering or Nima Gambu. The photo proves Gao was at the summit with Fisher because Lobsang told me Gao was never far from these two Sherpas on May 10th until he collapsed during his descent approximately 300 vertical feet below the balcony and was too weak to descend any further. At that point, Mingma Sering and Nima Gambu left Gao on a snow-covered ledge and continued down to the South Col without him. We know that Fisher arrived on top of Everest around 3:40 because that's when he made the radio call to his expedition doctor at base camp, Ingrid Hunt, to announce he was on the summit. When I interviewed Lobsang, he told me he arrived on the summit around 2:15, remained there until about 4, and was on top when Gao's team arrived. Although Lobsang didn't say the precise time Gao reached the summit, he did say that Mingma Sering and Nima Gambu arrived on the summit shortly after Fisher got there at 3:40, and Gao arrived soon thereafter. Moreover, all 3 members of Gao's team were on top before Fisher started to descend around 3:55, according to Lobsang. So, we know that Fisher was on the summit at 3:40. And we also know that Scott Fisher, Lobsang Zhangbu, Makalu Gao, Mingma Sering, and Nima Gambu were all on top at the same time because Fisher took the photo published on page 293 of my book. As Tracy correctly noted, quote, "Few people on the summit at 3:45 survived, much less would have had accurate memories of exactly what time everything happened," end quote. But the photo above, which was developed from the film recovered with Scott Fisher's camera, confirms that Gao's team arrived on the summit during the same span of time between when Fisher arrived at approximately 3:40 and when Fisher headed down at approximately 3:55. This is why I reported that Makalu Gao reached the summit of Everest around 3:45 p.m. in Into Thin Air. The Himalayan Database was an outgrowth of the voluminous expedition archives created and maintained by the deservedly famous Kathmandu-based historian Elizabeth Hawley. Despite the errors I've pointed out in the Himalayan Database, it is an extraordinary resource. When I was writing Into Thin Air in 1996 and early 1997, however, the database was much less accurate than it is today. As Tracy points out in a video titled Correcting the Record on Krakauer Statistics, posted on August 19, 2024, and I quote, "In 1996 and 1997, the Himalayan Database as we know today did not exist. The data was being maintained by Elizabeth Hawley and consisted of her numerous notes of interviews with various expedition members and notes about climbing permits. A single Nepali data entry clerk had been working for 3 years entering the data, and by 1996, the database was starting to take shape, but it would take almost 8 more years and a total of 11,000 hours of work to get the database into the form we use today. During that period, computer programmer Richard Salisbury worked on getting the data into a workable database, and in 2003, he and co-author Raymond Huey published an analysis of the data in the American Alpine Journal. Shortly after that, copies of the database were sold to the public, and every year an updated version is released documenting the summits, deaths, and other key statistics. Today, the entire database is available for free online. So when John Krakauer got the data from Elizabeth Hawley back in 1996 or early 97, it was the best that was available. But the data set would not be ready for proper analysis for another 7 years. Not surprisingly, the analysis it provided was completely wrong. Garbage in, garbage out, as they say. End quote. So that's Michael Tracy explaining that the Himalayan database was not very reliable in 1996 and 97. And that's because Liz Hawley primarily depended on her interviews with climbers after their expeditions for the data in the database. And that data was only as good as the accuracy of what the climbers told Hawley. And they got a lot of things wrong due to memory or self-aggrandizement or who knows what. I unwittingly relied on this, quote, completely wrong analysis when I wrote the following in chapter 21 of In Thin Air. Quote, in fact, the murderous outcome of 1996 was in many ways simply business as usual. Although a record number of people died in the spring climbing season on Everest, the 12 fatalities amounted to only 3% of the 398 climbers who ascended higher than base camp, which is actually slightly below the historical fatality rate of 3.3%. Or here's another way to look at it. Between 1921 and May 1996, 144 people died, and the peak was climbed some 630 times, a ratio of 1 in 4. Last spring, 12 climbers died, and 84 reached the summit, a ratio of 1 in 7. Compared to these historical standards, 1996 was actually a safer than average year, end quote. Until Tracy pointed out that the data I relied on for the excerpt above was incorrect, I was unaware that 1996 was actually an extremely deadly year on Everest, rather than safer than the average year, as I wrote. This is a huge error on my part. I should have noticed earlier, and I'm grateful Tracy made me aware of it. I will correct the error in all future editions of In Thin Air.